And we're live. What the woke is up, friends? We got a new series. After the success of our common topic that we normally focus on, Israel-Palestine, we decided to expand our reach. Now, what do I mean by success? We're at the point where we get messages on an almost weekly basis from both Israelis and Palestinians sharing that their view of the conflict and their understanding of the other side has been transformed by discovering our channel. It is our hope that we can take this same model of reconciliation between people in conflict and move it into other spaces. Why did we decide to move to the topic of social justice? Well, it seemed like a very natural evolution for us. Both Jews and Palestinians both find themselves allied with other social justice movements and social justice activists. Also, we ourselves are a group of activists and we consider social justice to be essential. So this was a natural evolution. Israel-Palestine will still be our hummus and pita, always. But it's very exciting. And I couldn't be more excited to have Iona and Rod on as our first guests. To my top left, Iona Italia is Enlightenment scholar, Tango dancer, copy editor and translator, and the author of the books Anxious Employment and Our Tango World. She will also take over from Helen Pluckrose as the editor-in-chief of Areo magazine from May 4th. She's also the host of the podcast 2 for Tea. And Rod Graham, to my top right, is an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. When he's not playfully provoking people on Twitter, which he does, I follow him, he researches and teaches cybercrime. He also has a YouTube channel where he has conversations with folks about social issues. You could find links to more of their social media in the description. And I definitely urge everybody to follow them on their platforms. Iona and Rod are actually quite unique. It's uncommon in today's world to find a respectful and nuanced conversation on the topic of social justice. We don't see much of it, and especially not on Twitter. Somehow these two have managed to, despite their ideological differences, to maintain a friendship through the Twitter sphere and engage with one another. It's for this reason that I really wanted them on as our first guest. As you know, our platform is all about finding common ground. It's not about fighting with one another. Well, working out differences for sure, but it's not a debate. It's not a battle. It's really about trying to understand one another and common ground at the end of the day. So Rod and Iona, it's a great pleasure to have you both. Before we get started, a quick shout out to our Patreon visionary members. I almost forgot to do this, very important. We have Max Marine, we have Geffen Posner, we have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd, we have SOG Cannabis, and we have our two newest visionary members, Raja and Adam Albilia. Adam, you'll have to let me know if I pronounce your last name correctly or not. And if anyone wants to support the show, you can find links in the description. And it's really the supporters who help us continue to make this content possible. So thank you, everybody. Let's get down to business, friends.
All right.
We are going to start with the topic of whiteness. We hear a lot of talks about whiteness, terms like proximity to whiteness, decentering whiteness. We're going to take a deep dive into what this actually means. So Rod, we're going to start with you. Can you kind of just give a little overview of what whiteness is and how you perceive it?
Yeah. So whiteness is the normative behaviors in Western society, and mainly we're talking the U.S. and I guess even the UK as well. And those normative behaviors are generally attached to white people. So it's almost like a kind of a culture of white people, but it's not about white people themselves. Actually, I like to think of it so there are like three white words. There's white supremacy, whiteness, and white privilege, and they kind of work together. So this idea of white supremacy, and so of course we're not talking about all those things, but in order to understand whiteness, it might be good to contextualize it a bit. So white supremacy is this idea that white people tend to dominate, I guess, American society, also the UK, and whiteness is the behaviors attached to that dominant group. And in order to get the privileges, you need to have those behaviors. So white privilege will be based on you having those behaviors. So in a way, the proximity to whiteness is having those behaviors, those mannerisms, even the aesthetic of white people. So I hope that kind of describes it.
Thank you, Rod. I appreciate that. So, Iona, do you find it to be a useful concept, in how Rod described it and how it's being used?
Not really. So I could see some use for it in a kind of in a kind of cultural way. I don't know. I would think of pumpkin spice latte as being the apotheosis of whiteness. So I think you could see it as being a kind of cultural thing. So here in the UK, it would be drinking tea and listening to Radio 4 and doing crosswords in the newspaper and things of that kind. But those are really the reason we associate those things as being white culture is because the population is majority white. I actually don't like this as a racial term either, but I'm going to just use it for the sake of simplicity. The majority population is white, so I think 73% of Brits are white European in origin. And therefore, there is a kind of spillover association with certain cultural things as being white culture because they're the culture of the UK. I would question that. I think that today's world is much more globalized, and also the UK is much more multicultural. So I think it's much less the case that specific traditionally British things are necessarily kind of white things or preferred by white people. What I don't find useful is a sort of totalizing, the use of whiteness as a kind of totalizing explanation for everything that is unjust or sinister or undesirable in society. And I find it almost slightly conspiratorial. It's kind of the work of pervasive whiteness everywhere. And people have even been talking about multiracial whiteness, which is really extraordinary to me. And it sounds to me very often in the way that social justice scholars are using it as a kind of metaphor for the devil. It's the work of whiteness, like the work of the devil, everywhere, kind of permeating everything and making everything worse. And I don't find that helpful at all as an image.
Yeah, I don't know. Is it one of these things where we can kind of do a back and forth? Or
yeah. Go for it.
Okay. So I don't know, Iona, you might be constructing this thing that doesn't quite exist through, Twitter experiences. I mean, I don't. To me, whiteness is a good analytical way of understanding things. It's a good tool. It really is. I mean, and this is from a scholar's point of view. So maybe you're talking about how it's used out in the real world or how activists sometimes may stretch the term. But let's take, for example, the Hispanic young man who graduates from college and he goes to get his first job. Okay. Now, when he walks into that building, he's going to probably change himself a little bit to fit in. Now, one way to think about that is, it's just the culture of his job. Everyone has to change. but he's probably going to have to leave behind a little bit of his mannerisms, his ways of thinking, or not maybe ways of thinking, but just way of carrying himself, the things that he talks about. His cultural references won't be there. That's not a bad thing. He's going to get paid, but that's how whiteness works. Like, it helps us understand that, or maybe even understanding how women of color feel that they have to maybe thin their nose or change the way they look because there's this particular aesthetic that most of the West finds most beautiful. And so in order to understand how that happens, you have to kind of look at this idea of whiteness.
There are several things there. First of all, I would say I'm not a huge fan of professional culture, and I've noticed there has been an enormous drive towards professionalizing everything we do. So I notice a lot of young people on social media, for example, saying your social media accounts should be your personal brand, quote unquote. It shouldn't be your place to just say whatever you think and whatever comes into your head, but you should be aware that you're presenting a kind of image of yourself to the world. And I'm not a fan of that kind of fakery. But I'm also not sure how that would connect specifically to whiteness. I mean, I would say that here in the UK, certainly the ethnic group who are the most concerned with professionalism and who are the most represented within the kind of higher echelons, managerial jobs, and in medicine and in law and in accountancy and all of those kinds of professions, are definitely British Indians. And the culture of working very hard at school, getting all your A-levels, going to university, and then going to get putting on your suit and being all spruced up and going to the office and getting your job. I wouldn't regard that as a white culture, because that is as whiteness, because that is so much more. Those are values so much more strongly stressed in British Indian families than in most white families. And poor white boys are the ones who are most struggling at school and who have the lowest achievements. Whereas, by contrast, Black men, for example, are only 4% of I think maybe less. I think Black people are 4% of the UK population. Mixed race is much larger, but and nevertheless, Black men are 7% of doctors. So in whatever environment you go into in Britain, almost every environment, every public space and public environment is like, what's happened? I disappeared. I'm back. Is likely to be a majority. The majority of people there are likely to be white European people, because 3/4 of the country are white European in origin. But I don't really think of that as those kinds of spaces as being necessarily white spaces.
Oh, that's interesting. And I can't speak obviously to the dynamics of the UK, but certainly in the US, there's been a long history of people of color having to code switch. And I don't even know if that's bad. I mean, if you're going into a different environment, you have to think about the expectations of other folks. So in this sense, it's not a bad thing. It's just analyzing what's happening. And so it's certainly the case that if you're Black, you might feel that you have to act a little differently when you enter into a space that's has more white people. So maybe it's different. And I wouldn't use those broad statistics. I mean, that's true. These things that people might point out about, even in the US, you have a lot of Asian immigrants who are in high status jobs, first and second generation. And so someone can make the argument, well, I mean, is this really white culture, this type of thing? But this is a qualitative type of assessment here. So trying to understand it through the numbers may not necessarily work. So in some ways, I get the concerns that people have. For example, you just mentioned, you were talking about dressing up and looking nice and all of these types of things that all of us would consider good, right? So the argument will be, well, why are you saying that this normal thing that everyone does in a capitalist society is considered white? And I think that's a fair critique, but it's also a surface critique in many ways. I think that scholars who try and understand how different cultures navigate being a minority, they see all of these tiny little ways where that minority culture is not represented in wider society, and they try and point those things out. So I don't know. It's not like I'm saying you're wrong. I just think that there's something deeper happening here that may not come out on Twitter or on social media.
I'm going to just switch the light on 1 second.
Yeah, sure. Rod, I have a follow-up question for you. Would you say it's fair to frame it as if there's a dominant culture in each society, and people who are not of that dominant culture, and again, being part of a culture is not zero sum, right? You could be partially part of a culture in some areas and not in others, but those not part of that dominant culture are going to need to code switch in order to get ahead. Now, people focused on racial justice are viewing activism in terms of their own struggle. So they might call this dominant culture as whiteness. But I could perceive a situation where, let's say, someone who in the US has a Southern accent, they don't sound so sophisticated, right? So they might need to change a Southern white man, they might need to change their accent a little bit just to get ahead. So they might view that as like Northern privilege or socioeconomic privilege, and they would frame it based off their lived experience, how they perceive it. So would you agree that that's essentially what's happening? It's trying to describe dominant culture from the perspective, from our lived experiences, from what we experience day to day?
I don't know about the lived experiences part. You're right that in the abstract, in any type of diverse society, there's likely going to be a dominant culture, and if you sort of take on the characteristics of that culture, you'll get benefits from it. Sometimes you can't take, like if it's a racial thing, then you can't. I mean, I'm not going to ever look white, right? So if there was some benefits to that, I'm not going to have it. But the cultural parts, yes, in any culture. So that part is true. But the reason why you use whiteness is because this is rooted in a particular historical context where, in the US and the UK and a lot of colonized countries, it was in fact being white that mattered. And so you can certainly talk about in the abstract dominant culture, subordinate culture, majority culture, minority culture, but then you'll be losing the accuracy of history. So, I'm sure in China, some scholar could say, Han supremacy or something like that. Mm-hmm. But that particular Han supremacy would have unique characteristics that make it whatever that would be, Han supremacy, whatever that is. And so, yes, you're right that it's about a dominant culture, but it is important to keep that specificity here. And then this idea of lived experiences, I think you're right that the world is very complex and there are a lot of things that we need to take into account. It's not the case that if you're just a white person, that's all you need, just walk out of the house and you can get whatever you want. There are things that if you are poor, you don't have money. If you're from the South, like I am, you may have a Southern dialect and people might think that you're a country bumpkin. All those things do matter. So it is.
The Southern voice.
Iona loves it.
So yes, complexity is important to add to any understanding of the world, certainly.
I would question the idea that, yes, I understand this historically. Historically, this is absolutely true that being white was the important thing. And adding a little bit of my own background because my father was Indian and my mother was Scottish. And I am Indian Parsi. Parsi identity is patrilineal, so I am a Parsi. And during the Raj, there were many mixed race children were born to Europeans who were visiting India, and usually European women and Indian men. So people who are tend to have a quite wide range of skin colors, and and others they would decide on the basis of the India or sent back to kind of in the UK are the most supposedly white European spaces. A big splotch in the middle, a little below the top groups and a little above the bottom groups, which is just what you would expect statistically. But it's not the case that there are white people at the top and everybody else is below them. Socially and economically, certain other groups are more successful in our society.
So wait, that example about the flower is that doesn't seem to be about being. It just seems like you were charming the people in the room. I don't know if that had anything to do with being.
Well, I tried.
But okay. I think that okay. I should back up a little bit about this whiteness thing, because we are talking about like culture and code switching, and that is important. But I think the academic discourse around it is that okay, we have this notion that there's this this collection of behaviors and attitudes and whatnot that are associated with white people, and that the other types of behaviors and attitudes and whatnot.
You do. I don't. I don't have this notion.
You don't have. Okay.
Or one has this notion, perhaps, but yes, okay, I don't share that notion.
and so the ultimate goal actually is to decenter. I think you mentioned at the beginning, whiteness, or in some cases, some would say dismantle it. Because the idea is that all of these different ways of living in our world and being and our bodies and how we look, they should all be seen, at least in the abstract, as equal. And I think that's what a lot of the scholars are trying to get at. I mean, I don't know if we are good at doing that, but that's the general idea. And so that often gets kind of distorted in social media or something, where it's people will conflate a European American or a Brit with whiteness and assume that when someone is attacking whiteness, they're attacking the person, and that's not what's going on there, or at least that's not what I think is going on there. So
I think that I would certainly agree if we're talking about appearance. So, I mean, appearance and aesthetics is a very subtle thing, and it's hard to legislate. I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm terribly convinced that here in the UK there is an aesthetic that prefers European-looking people. Definitely in India there is a preference for paler-skinned Indians. The ideal, however, is not to look white. That's going too far. You need to still look Indian, but as pale as it's possible to be while still looking recognizably Indian. That's the kind of ideal. And my friend Visakan Veerasamy has made a sort of photo montage collection of very dark-skinned South Indians walking past advertising posters that show these incredibly pale-skinned Bollywood stars and things. Some of them actually South Indians who've just been photoshopped to a point of kind of unrecognizability. They've gone from just like dark chocolate to barely sort of a redhead who went out in the sun for 5 minutes. Look, it's astounding. And Visakan's thing is titled, "Why Do We Hate Ourselves?" So I noticed that in India, but I don't really see strong evidence of that kind of aesthetic preference here in the UK. And I think that on a very basic level, we can call the lie on that when we look at how many people are in quote unquote mixed race relationships. It's a lot. And that is important here. I think if you are some white guy from Essex with a really strong accent, I'm saying this partly to wind up Helen Pluckrose in case she ever hears this program.
I hope she does.
But I think that if you have a very working class sort of accent, and you are not very articulate, and you're not very, you don't have a wide vocabulary and those kinds of things, you're going to come across worse in situations. But I don't think that that is connected with race. At least not here. I don't see a connection with race in that. And is there a specific way of acting? I mean, I think one of the crucial factors, which is aligned with race in a sense, is are you, so there is a reason why many, for example, Indian Brits also, there's a reason why many Black men go into medicine and not many Black men go into theater. And I think the reason for this has nothing to do with needing to look in a particular way for theater. It has to do with if you are the child of immigrants, as I am actually, or you are the grandchild of immigrants, the immigrant mentality is that you don't have a lot of inherited wealth. And therefore, if you are a clever, bright person, you need to go out and get yourself an excellent job in a very steady career that will pay well. So you're not going to go into acting or journalism or some other. You're not going to decide to become a professional violinist or do some other career which is so poorly and unreliably paid for most people who are in that career that most people who go into that career from nice middle class backgrounds who know that if everything goes balls up, their parents will be able to support them. So I think that there is a cultural connection there, and I think that that is something that all immigrants share. So when people say we need to diversify theater, for example, we need more Black actors in theater, I think this is the wrong way of looking at it. What we need, if we want more Black actors in theaters, we need theater to be a profession that actually pays people decently, and therefore people who are not middle class will want to go into that profession.
You know, so here in the U.S., being white helps you in most cases. I mean, I can imagine some isolated, one corporation wants to hire a person of color, so therefore they're specifically looking for a person of color, or maybe on the basketball court where the stereotype is that Black people are good at basketball or something. But other than those types of isolated incidents, no. So Iona is speaking from a UK context. I won't comment on that, but I will comment on some of the logic here. So when you talk about class, right? The idea is that, well, it wasn't race in this situation. It was because of this person's income or their language or something. It's not really a race thing at all. The idea is that holding those things constant, being white is not a detriment, and it may even help you. So yeah, you can have a poor white person, you can have a poor Black person. That poor white person may have an easier time navigating at least American society than that poor Black person. So
that is possible, but statistically speaking, they are the group who are performing. Poor white boys are the group who are performing worse statistically. That doesn't mean to say that if you're poor and white and you're poor and Black, you're not at an advantage being poor and white. That's very possible.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know, and I'd be willing to imagine that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, I like the logic with saying, instead of trying to push more Black actors, more Black people into being actors, Instead, you need to change the incentives so that they'll decide to make that choice. That actually makes quite a bit of sense. But I think what happens is, instead of combining those arguments, what people do is they'll use one argument to dismiss the second. So it is absolutely the case that if you change incentives, that will pull people in different directions, regardless of race. But then when you look at it, you that doesn't then discount the fact that if all things being equal, if you're a white person, it's a lot easier for you to get that job, possibly. I have a lot of conversations online with people who like to point out like the things about affirmative action in the U.S. and look at this, this black guy gets into Harvard, or even Hispanic guy gets into Harvard with the SAT scores 100 points less than the Asian person. And you know what? I don't think that's actually right. So my response is always, okay, fine. Don't do these kinds of things. Just, wherever discrimination is found, address specifically that. That's always my argument. And generally people don't like that argument because they know in the back of their minds that you're going to see that discrimination and there'll be a lot more things that have to be done. So they don't like that argument either. Because people, I think, in the US know that overall it's probably a little bit better to be white still. But that is changing. It's not like it's an all negative thing. We've made a lot of progress. But,
I do. So a couple of things. One is that I do like that argument. So I do think that what you need to do is look at discrimination rather than trying to right the balance by privileging some people over others. So I'm against anti-affirmative action in the US, which I think is anti-Asian discrimination. It's just replacing kind of one form of discrimination with another. But the problem is always that it's extremely hard to prove discrimination happened. Where I find the case most convincing is in police treatment of Black suspects. So I was actually fairly convinced by that scholar, what's his name? This is what happens when you get to my age. It has just disappeared. This African-American scholar who wrote a famous article, which is constantly cited, about what he showed was that police were just as likely to shoot non-Black suspects as Black suspects. And, having seen,
Fryer, I think that's his name.
Roland Fryer, yes. Mm-hmm. Having read Stuart Ritchie's debunking of the Fryer study, and also Ali Rizvi's work on that, my conclusion is that nothing can be concluded from the Fryer study. And we simply don't know. But I do think it's plausible. I don't know for certain, but if I had to guess one way or another, I would go with yes, it's plausible that Black suspects are in general treated worse by US police, and that is a very big deal. So that's one place where I would see discrimination. But I think that it's very hard in any other specific case to prove discrimination. So if I have to hire, I don't know, if I have to hire a copy editor and I have two people apply for the job, one is Black and one isn't, and I hire the one who isn't Black, was that discrimination? I mean, that's extremely hard to prove. Maybe the other one was a better copy editor, or demanded less money, or was more reliable, or whatever. Or maybe I'm just a racist. I don't think that it's really hard to prove motivation in individual instances. And it's especially hard when people are expecting imbalances that have happened much further down the path to be redressed further up. So when they're, for example, saying to a university, you don't have enough Black faculty, and nevertheless, the number of Black faculty they have is, the proportion of Black faculty is greater than the number who applied. That, I can see what they're saying, which is we want more Black people to be in academe. But if you are trying to address imbalances of that kind, you have to start much further down the ladder than at the point where you're choosing from an applicant pool.
Yeah, it is hard to. I wouldn't even worry about motivation. Actually, I'm more interested in the patterns, like or the patterns leading to racially disparate outcomes, right? So you're right about motivation. You don't know, and there's no. To me, it doesn't even matter actually. If it happens that teachers are sending Black kids or Hispanic kids out of the classroom for the same infractions that they keep the white kids in. I don't even know if the teachers are racist. It's just maybe they're not understanding the mannerisms, or, it comes from a Black person. It might seem more harsh, and so they get a little antsy and they kick the kid out. That's not actually racist in motivation, but it's certainly racist in intent. And so I wouldn't worry about it. Mm-hmm.
I can tell you for certain that that's not happening here, because I know that poor white boys are the group that are doing worst in school. That specifically, that's not a generalization about poorer lower class white men throughout life. I'm just talking only
You've
about
been complaining about poor white boys all this whole thing. There must be something we need to look into here.
Well, it is white boy summer, coming up.
I want to move on to just a more solution-oriented part of the conversation. This was like the conceptual part. I do want to move to solutions, but if either of you have final thoughts on the topic of whiteness, now would be the time.
I would just say that there are ethnic minority groups which are more insular in UK society. So in particular, Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups have a high proportion of people who are religious, and for religious reasons don't intermarry with a general population. You're in Israel, so you know all about this. But in the case, for example, that is not the case with Black Brits, who are a very diverse group, actually, in terms of their origins and when they arrived here historically, and but also a really high proportion that the estimate is half are in relationships with non-Black people. So that is a huge number of mixed race kids and blended families and stepfathers and stepmothers of children who are quote unquote different race from them. So I think that the idea of this kind of patchwork of racial groups, that here are the Black people over here and here are the Indians over here, and we don't really have Hispanics, or they're not an official category in the census, which a friend of mine who is from Colombia got very angry about. She's like, there's no Hispanic box for me to tick here, because we just had our census done in the UK. But I think that it increasingly doesn't make sense to think in those terms. And I'm very convinced by the demographics in Eric Kaufman's book, White Shift, where he basically says that the conception that the UK, for example, is a white country, is that whole entire perception is going to be over within a century. The number of people who are going to be mixed race and whose ethnic origins will be unclear or irrelevant or just a muddle is rising exponentially.
Okay. Well, I don't have any final. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Iona.
Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Right.
Okay. No, I don't have. I was just gonna alert the audience that if they see me bouncing like this when I get animated, it's because my office chair is broken, so I'm sitting on a ball. That's it.
It's good for
I'm-
those
I-
abs of yours.
Yeah, I was going to say core strength.
Yes, yes. My core, yeah.
So I guess if I'm just to summarize the difference here, I mean, it's clear that, you know, Raj, you being in the United States and Iona being in the UK gives you slightly different perspectives. As I'm sure your experiences have also given you different perspectives. Iona, it seems like you don't, even if there is some dominant culture, it's not so quantifiable, and you're not convinced that even if it is quantifiable, how many advantages you get from it. You think there may just be advantages. There's also advantages to being a minority as well, and it shouldn't be the focus of our activism. And Raj, you clearly state that whiteness exists. It benefits you, and for non-white people to succeed, it would help them to code switch or do what they can to be more white in order to succeed in life.
I guess that's
Right.
yeah.
If
Whiteness,
I'm to,
I guess the best way to say it though is not that whiteness benefits you as much as it doesn't. Being white doesn't hurt you. That's
Okay.
probably a better way to say it. Yeah.
That seems fair. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So we're not gonna bridge every divide, unfortunately, but at least we engaged on this one respectfully. I want to talk a little bit about solutions. I think often conversations just get stuck on theory and philosophy and history. It's definitely the case for Israel-Palestine. Like, I need to drag people through the mud just to get them sitting like and talking about solutions. So I really want us to talk about that. Iona, we'll start with you. It's clear that people are in pain. We don't have global protests in cities around the world, growing social justice movements, if there wasn't an issue. What that issue is, there may not be an agreement on. But I want to ask you what you think is really driving a lot of this pain, and what you think a possible solution or step in the right direction is.
I think that a lot of it has come from people's economic insecurities, and that's completely understandable and justifiable. So I think that people who are in their 20s now are their parents' generations were very often able to, when they found a job that was a career and it lasted for 30 years, they were able to buy houses at a relatively low price, at a price that was correlated with their income. And now young people are leaving university massively in debt, especially in the US. It's this completely casual gig economy for many people. It's a real struggle just making it through from month to month. It's also impossible for most younger people to buy property. And so it's this, for me, it's this existential anxiety about how you are going to manage to survive and live comfortably. And in the US, you have the added factor of not having a national health service.
So it's primarily a socioeconomic issue. So the policy should be socioeconomic focused.
For me, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you guys, I'm looking at Rod here, accusatorily, you guys should have elected Bernie when you had the chance. But I know you don't agree. But also, yes, I do. I think that the solutions are to be found in better social safety nets, better ways to value people's skills, and a society in which is just less economically harsh and frightening. And I'm talking about everybody here. not just white
Right.
voice.
Thanks, Iona. So, Rod, what solutions would you like to see?
Well, I guess I'll piggyback off of Iona. You know, economic inequality has been rising, in the West and especially in the U.S. And yes, we don't have the healthcare, so that makes it more of a problem. And so that would, if we could somehow address that issue, somehow. I've heard a lot of, solutions, universal basic income and all these things, and raising the minimum wage. However that goes down, it is important that we deal with the rising economic inequality. So that's nice, and it'll soak up a lot of the issues related to a lot of these racial issues that we've been talking about here. Actually, it won't be the be all and end all of it, but it'll soak a lot of it up if we can deal with that. So that's one thing. But the protests are really, at least here in the U.S., they're about what I would call genuine full equality between racial groups. So, and what that means is, in the 1960s, my cord here is, in the 1960s and 70s, I think a lot of progress was made legally, right? So legally, there is no difference in how, by law mainly, how Black and white folks are treated, or Hispanic folks are treated. And so I think for a lot of people, they saw that as, okay, great, now everything's fine and we're cool. And we went through this era in the 70s and 80s and 90s of this kind of color blindness ethic. And a lot of people kind of soaked that in. And so now in 2010 and 2015 and 2021, when folks are talking about this sort of social and cultural equality and pushing for that, people are like, where's this coming from? I don't understand it. We're all equal by law. So why are you complaining so much? And I think that's something that we need to take seriously. Those folks who are, these social justice activists who are complaining about these cultural differences, that's something real that people are concerned about, and they want that addressed. They don't want that pushed under the rug, or be called irrational or woke or whatnot. I mean, these are real serious issues, and so it would be nice if people can address them. Culturally, so that's one thing, and other protests are about the police brutality, and that's actually a pretty good example. I'm rambling a bit, but a person may say, look, the laws are the same. They're creating there's crime there, and so police are going into those neighborhoods, and that's the real issue, is the crime rate, and just comply or something, and you won't have any problem. I think that's Sam Harris's argument or something. And so a lot of folks are saying, no, this is something here that you need to understand, that police are coming in as a kind of occupying force. They don't do that in white neighborhoods. Yes, we're all equal under the law and all, but clearly there are some patterns here that need to be addressed, and that's what we're complaining about. And I think that at this point, people are seeing that a little bit more. Now I'm going to throw a dig a little bit at Iona, and Iona knows
Yeah, do it.
knows this, that I'm not a big fan of publications like Areo and Quillette and others, these kind of anti-woke publications. And the reason why is not, I respect the fact that, people have different political views and they should air them out and talk about them and discuss things. The problem is they generate arguments that then slow that progress down. So Black people have been complaining about policing for decades. It's not new, okay? And there's a lot of all types of research, qualitative, quantitative, first-person accounts. It doesn't matter, showing that, okay, that there's some inequality here. It's not legal inequality. Cops are cops. They're treating everyone the same, they think, but they're not. It's a cultural problem. Okay, so then I'll read some publication where that person doesn't know about that history, doesn't know about that research, and then they use these sort of logical arguments to say, well, this isn't really a problem. There's no systemic racism in policing. Okay, so someone reads that, and then when they get a chance to vote for a change, they say, oh, well, I don't know, And I think that's a problem. that's a problem. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but I think that's
Is there a specific policy you'd like to see passed that you think would help?
Oh, that's right, because we're talking about solutions here, and not so theoretical. I've come around to this notion of defunding the police. At first, I thought this was crazy, and I did the thing that a lot of people do. They see the tagline, they go, "Oh, this is nonsense," because I thought it was nonsense. I mean, you need police in neighborhoods. People are not always so nice, and who's going to be the person to handle the not nice people? But after reading about the logic behind it and what's actually going on, I think that's a wonderful way of dealing with it. Police are inherently now in the U.S. antagonistic towards communities, and they're over-policing those communities. And so if we can shift some of the
How do you feel about
devised from the ground up? I noticed this attitude gun, the policeman's gun. And I would,
because the U.S. military is so overfunded, the police, I know this as an ex-IDF soldier, when you have a gun, get these new toys, these new guns, they're training to use a weapon, knowing that, again, I'm only speaking from my personal experience, but I know myself and many other soldiers, we just wanted to be able to use it. I think it's something many soldiers go through. So I imagine police actually go through something similar when they're constantly getting new and nice weapons. So that's one thing on the military industrial complex that somehow connects to police violence, which is interesting. And the other is the fact that America is just so armed. I don't know if that brings us any closer to a solution, but it kind of just adds maybe a layer of complexity to how challenging it is. I guess we can all agree, though, that more accountability is needed, right? Like, as long as power exists, we need some mechanisms in order to hold it accountable.
Yeah.
So you're right about the connection between the military and police in America. In fact, I think starting in the 60s or 70s to deal with some riots that were occurring in the late 60s. I think President Nixon signed some kind of bill or law or something that made it so that the equipment that the military uses can then be donated to police so that they could use it in those neighborhoods. And that has continued. I think now people are realizing that connection and they're stopping that because it's true. You have police have this SWAT gear and tanks even. And so they use it in a neighborhood because they're trying to protect themselves. I think, as I believe Iona said, protect themselves at all costs because they want to protect themselves. So they go in with the SWAT gear and a tank to deal with some type of drug issue. And I think that's why, to me, if you can just have less of those encounters between an occupation that is, so police are violence workers in a way, right? They deal with violence and stopping violence and using violence to stop violence. And so to me, it's just hard to see a way where you can still have police have all of these encounters and it not lead to a lot of violence. And so it's better to find alternative ways of dealing with issues that don't require that violence, like a traffic stop. I mean, can we come up with a way that police don't have to do that job? I don't know.
I mean, do they really have to stop people who have a faulty taillight or something? I think those kinds of things you should just take a photo of the license plate number and send them a text. So I think that a lot of and I do think, I don't know how workable this would be, so I'm just spitballing here, but I could imagine that you are policing a neighborhood by just having a police presence, officers patrolling, and those officers need not be armed, and if there is an incident there, then they can call for reinforcements, but it prevents this sort of going instantly into panic mode. I mean, I recently saw, and it may be worse, it may be exacerbated by racial issues. I'm not certain of that, but I'm inclined towards thinking that it is. but I won't stand up in the court of law and swear to it. But it's really police's treatment of people, because we certainly see that also happening. For example, this stuff and the
very vague concepts that are hard to tax, because that's an extremely classist policy, and because of a legacy of racism, you have Black people are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Their public schools are funded less. That's obviously an issue. Criminal justice reform also elevate Black communities, elevate white communities. The reason I'm talking about these specific policies is because I think it's something that we get people to agree on, right? It's like if you want to push a policy position that helps white people and Black people, you have a coalition. When you have a coalition, it's much easier to get things done. And I also view white America and Black America working together towards common goals on policy can actually be part of a well-needed reconciliation process between white and Black America, which I don't think we've had enough of. So I would like to see that social justice movement in the United States really hone in on take a few core sets of policies that white people can also get on board with, just because that's the way to build a coalition, and really drive that in. And I think that's the best way to transform the country for the better.
Okay.
You asked. You asked.
Yeah, no, that's a common way of describing it. I think it's fine to try and come up with ideas that are specific, and also both Black and white people can get behind. I don't think anyone would have a problem with that. I do think that a lot of the ideas that are presented just don't help white people, because it's not about white people. And so sometimes people get angry at me when I say this, but I do believe that a lot of this is self-interest. If I say, okay, I don't know, what would be something, kind of a policy? I don't know. Safe spaces. Okay, so a university says, all right, we're going to make it so that there's a safe space for Black and Hispanic students to go, right? They've experienced some microaggressions or something. I don't know. All right, that does not help white people, because it's not for them. So they'll be upset about it. I'm not quite sure what to do about that, actually, because the policy is not for you. I mean, it's like, you know, I want to increase veterans benefits, which I would like. I'm a veteran. Then okay, but it's not for you, non-veteran, you know. So I'm not entirely sure how to deal with that, really.
I am in favor of safe spaces, because I think safe spaces fall under freedom of association. So if people want to have a Black and Hispanics only group or room or whatever else at their university, I'm A-okay with that, as long as they don't make the entire university into a safe space. As long as it's not, these people can't be invited onto campus to speak or whatever, because this will harm us. As long as it's an opt-in and opt-out system, I'm 100% okay with that. But I do think that the most important thing is creating a wide coalition and having shared goals. And I think that if it's true, which it may be in the US, here in the UK much less so, here in the UK I don't believe it's true, but if it's true, for example, that Black people, people of color are, because Black people aren't our largest ethnic minority group, but if people of color, let's say, are liable to be poorer than white people, just putting it very simply, if we have policies in place that help people who are struggling and in poverty, then that already benefits, let's say, the people of color more than white people, and that to me is not a problem, because the policy is not aimed racially. The policy is aimed at on the basis of need, not on the basis of identity, and that for me is a very important distinction.
Yeah, I think most people agree that dealing with poverty is important, and you don't need to put that link that to identity at all. So I mean, yeah.
So, I get what you say, Rod, about some policies are just not for people. It's like, how do we get them on board? It's we need people to be essentially altruistic, right? Vote for something or support something that doesn't benefit them. I think that's achievable, but wouldn't you agree? It doesn't need to be instead of all the policy that we could unite around, right? It's like if we could already build a coalition and transform lives, like there's all this energy. Like one of the greatest things, at least for me, that I like about what we're seeing in the social justice space is the energy, right? Energy can achieve results. You can't. It's hard to change legislation or transform a country without energy. So we have energy. How do we direct that into an avenue that is actually yielding positive results? So it seems like taking a few policy positions and really working on those. And some of those could be, for example, reparations. But like, how do we get that going? Less about the theory, more about the policy, or is that not something that you think we need to focus on? Do you think it should stay more in the realm of a cultural discussion about concepts like whiteness?
But I actually don't buy that premise that it's just all theory. I think that there are a lot of policies, either in institutions or at some federal national level, that people are proposing. Even the reparations idea is people have been proposing that for many years. It's just not going to go anywhere because, well, you're basically giving money or some kind of resources to a group of people, and another group just doesn't benefit from it. And so when that happens, people will quickly we will develop justifications to push back against it. But there are a lot of policies that people just don't like that will deal with a lot of these issues. So I don't really buy that premise.
Do you think that there's I don't mean to imply that there's no talk about policy, because all of the policy that I brought up as an example is I've learned from somewhere, right? People are having these conversations. It just, at least from my perspective, it seems that the conversation generally is around certain topics that are cultural and theoretical and not policy. The vast majority. Do you think the current balance is healthy, or we need to go be a little bit more policy oriented?
I just think that there are already solutions being proposed that people may not necessarily like. So I don't know. So let's pick a problem, and I'm sure that there's already been several policies proposed. So like the police brutality, like these ideas about defund the police, they've been instituted in certain areas of the country where activists and academics and policymakers got together. I can't remember the cities actually. Is it Minnesota? Somewhere I don't know. But anyway, where they got together and they said, okay, yes, let's try and shift funds away from police and put it somewhere else. That's a specific policy.
I think it was Minneapolis.
It was Minneapolis.
Yeah, I don't know that they were very. They had a very good set of policies in place, because I gather there's been a massive spate of violent crimes in Minneapolis now. So to me, it doesn't work to just shift funds away from police. You have to be clear about. You can't just have good intentions about this. You need to do a little bit of A/B testing, small scale testing. Shift things in one time and see what happens, and do your study, and then work out what are the best things to implement. There is a sense of urgency around things. I understand that, but I understand it, but I also don't find it helpful, because the thing about policies is that it's very often difficult to know how they will work on the ground. And very frequently they work very differently on the ground from the way that they were intended. And they do different things from what they were intended to do. And the only way to discover what will actually happen is testing.
That's true. That's true. I just want to say a little bit more about this policy thing. Because while Iona was talking, I was thinking about, all right, what is a problem, and what would be a kind of policy. And so I realized that I'm kind of doing this right now in my job. So my university is getting a lot more Black and brown students, and also students who are poor across the United States. There's been a shift in the past 20, 30 years where it's just been a change from the middle class white student at four-year colleges to it being much more diverse. So this is just across the country. So anyway, we want to make sure that those non-traditional students, I guess, do well. And so we kind of been reading and talking about whiteness, and how in this case it manifests itself as us thinking a certain type of student will be sitting in front of us. So, okay, that's kind of the concept behind it. Okay, we've been teaching for a certain student, but these different students are coming in that are not that way. So we need to change. So I've been asked to develop this sort of workshop. It's not an anti-bias workshop. I know people hate those things, but it's not that kind of thing. It's a workshop where I look back at the literature on cultural relevant pedagogy and how teachers can change their classroom so that it doesn't aim for that modal student, and it can take in, and we can teach these broad ranges of students more effectively. That's a specific, and that's been going on across the country. It's just now making it to my university. And I think that's generally what happens. So maybe on the surface, it looks as if it's, there's no policies, or there's no ideas out there. It's just all talk and culture. But if you kind of are in a specific environment, you'll see that folks are trying to are doing specific things to achieve success. Now, Iona's actually put something in my head here because it is the case that we would need to test to see whether or not these changes actually work. I don't know. So maybe I need to teach one class that's culturally relevant and the other class in my old style and see whether it matters. But
yeah, so there's something in there now. There's one thought wrestling around
there. Okay. Great. Well, we're closing in on an hour and a half. There's other things I wanted to touch on, but it's just opening up a whole other can of worms. So we might need to save it for round 2, which I would love to have. I'd love for this to be a regular little duo thing. It's funny because people like, there's like inside jokes going on Twitter about like flirting between you two, right? Like I'm always seeing stuff like that. Recent.
My boyfriend asked, should he be worried? So I told him,
yes,
he should be worried. Yes. Good to keep people on their toes, you know?
Yeah, recently someone posted like sexiest bald man of the year, and who was it? It was like Prince. I don't follow the Kardashians of England, the royal family. But
the Kardashians of England.
But which prince was it? Some prince who's not that attractive was voted.
He's not.
Which one was it?
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah. So one of the princes who's not so attractive was voted sexiest bald man of the year, and somebody tagged you both and said Iona's probably upset that Rod didn't get the nomination. And I'm sitting there thinking, hey, what about me?
What about you?
I want to share one more funny thing. So, our audience is very mixed. We have people from all sides of all the spectrums. And, as the conversation was going along, the more anti-woke crew, obviously what Iona was saying was very much resonating with them. And then she drops you should have voted for Bernie bomb. And their heads exploded because they didn't know how to reconcile those two concepts. There were a few people in the chat, they were loving everything you said until you suggested Bernie Sanders. And then he's like, oh, that communist, he's going to ruin the country. But
Yeah, I mean, I am a leftist, so I'm just not woke. I'm really not woke. So I will make common cause with you on your anti-woke stuff, but I'm not going to vote for the right. So,
Right.
but I don't. I try not to demonize people of different viewpoints, and I think that uh, far more people are wrong than are evil. You know, people who disagree with me are wrong, and they are to be pitied, and understood. And compassion should be had for them as human beings, because not everyone can be me and right all of the time. But nevertheless, we should not demonize people for their opposing political opinions. And I used to be just very, very pugnacious with people who disagreed with me politically. And I've only really recently come to realize that that was just stupid.
I'm
I'd
going in
say
the opposite direction. I'm more pugnacious, I guess.
Yeah. So now I'm much better at ignoring kind of pugnacity in other people. Also, I just feel you do your pugnacious thing over here, and I'll just continue thinking what I think.
As long as you two remain friends, then I'm okay with whatever evolution y'all are having. That's
Yeah, we'll stay friends, I'm sure.
Yes.
what you want to leave our audience with some final thoughts, final words?
I guess I'll start. I mean, first off, thanks for inviting me, and this was a fun talk. I like that we have these kind of conversations because on Twitter, you know, I like to kind of poke fun and stuff, but the more of these conversations that we have, I think the deeper understanding we get of these issues, maybe people can come to some more nuanced understanding, and we don't demonize people, as Iona pointed out. And I think in that way, this is great.
Awesome. It's been great having you, Rod.
Mm-hmm.
So I think race is basically a bullshit concept.
Wait a minute. See, now I ended differently. I wasn't gonna. First off, I want to make it clear. The social science research is clear on this. Race matters in the U.S. There's discrimination, there's prejudice at the individual and institutional levels, and you cannot get rid of that by not thinking about it. Okay.
Hey, wait! It's my turn now to say my final thoughts.
She was saving the closing words to come out swinging.
Yeah. So my final thoughts are: race is a bullshit concept, and the quicker we get away from preoccupation with race, and the better. That's going to be my final thoughts, because I want to leave Rod with something to think about. You know.
Okay.
This was a lot of fun. Insightful conversation, and the first of many for What the Woke, the show. And I am serious. I would love to have you both on. So
sure.
let's continue chatting. Sure. And friends, if you liked what you heard from both Rod and Iona, I suggest you look in the description. You can find their information. If you're new to this channel, hit the subscribe button. We're doing a few live streams a week. Yeah, we love you. Signing out.